All right, I'm here again with Professor Tom Murphy of Do the Math blog fame, former astrophysics professor from UCSD. Now writes on myriad topics. I've just been going back through a lot of your blog, and I had ideas for questions I wanted to ask you, and then I was like, oh, he's actually written on this. Okay, cool. So it's
Nice.
a really rich resource. Um, you call yourself a recovering astrophysicist. Do you want to explain a little bit what you mean by recovering?
Yeah, by recovering, I mean that, and thanks for having me on, by the way. I mean that I was driven by that work and I thought it was just great fun and thought it was important and no longer do. So, um, it really defined a lot of my life, and that's no longer a defining and driving component. So that, I don't even pay attention to news about, the Webb telescope or,
Mhm.
anything. I can't even list the things that are going on because I just don't pay attention. So
So,
that's part of the
in other
recovery.
words, other topics like came to the fore that caught your interest that you felt were more important or at least more interesting to you to delve into. Um,
Right, right.
but I did want to highlight. I mean, like your past work at physics is really cool. Like you were had all it wasn't like you were some backwater guy. Like you had an amazing career in astrophysics, and some of the stuff that you were doing, like bouncing lasers off of mirrors on the moon as a way to determine whatever relativity or something like that. The only question I want about that old work, because I know it's not that interesting to you anymore, is how are there lasers or how are there mirrors on the moon if we fake the moon landing?
That's great. Yeah, that's I'm obviously part of the conspiracy, and even though nobody coerced me, I just built this apparatus and shot it at the moon and got the return. And based on my measurements, they were precise enough that I could see effectively the shape of the reflectors and their actual, size, rectangular size and orientation. They're oriented within a degree of how they're supposed to be, and they match the pictures, which is, astounding. And
Wow.
I actually have right here a corner cube prism that, um, no matter where I move it, you see the camera of my laptop right in the center.
Huh.
It's you see the little green
Yeah.
LED. And so these are retroreflectors, corner cube prisms that return light the same way they came from. And that's the trick. The back of it is just the corner of a cube.
Ah.
And so it's a neat little passive bit of optical geometry. So yeah, totally fake. And I'm proud to be part of the conspiracy.
But I assume you got to hang out with Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah. Um, actually, who is it? I always get mixed up. I think it was never mind. One of the famous science fiction writers, Arthur C. Clarke, contacted me about what arguments can you use against the fake lunar landings? And, I shared with him what I had, but in the end, nothing that I did could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that human hands placed these things on the moon. I mean, they could have been robotically deployed, but they are there. I mean, that I
Right.
am absolutely convinced of, and they matched the pictures. And I'm glad that they took pictures because it's a good documentation of the fact that they went there. But no, I stopped dealing with those people because nothing you say is convincing to them. They're not actually looking for resolution.
Right.
They're not genuinely curious. They have
They
an
already know that.
attitude. They know the answer, so it just was a waste of my time to engage.
So I was just being facetious, but actually that really kind of does tie into the meta topics that you're focusing on now, like the desire not to see certain things about modernity, certain things that we as a culture don't want to see, therefore we're not grappling with. So maybe as a lead in, one of the things that you produced over the past, year since we spoke is this series, the Metastatic Modernity series, which are 18 installments of relatively short, about 10-minute videos. Um, Give us an idea about that project and the topics that you cover and your intention for that aspect of your blog and your work.
Yeah, so I keep trying to capture my entire mindset in these projects. And maybe 4 years ago, I embarked on writing a textbook about, the predicament, but mostly focused on energy issues and a bit of resource issues. But that textbook is available for free as a PDF. It's called Energy Ambitions on a Finite Planet. Uh, Energy and Human Ambitions on a Finite Planet. I should know the title of my own book. Um, and almost as soon as I was finished with it, within probably 6 months, I thought, man, this is wrong. It's got the wrong. I mean, it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. It's got um, the framing is still in this mode, and this ties into the recovering astrophysics um, astrophysicist theme, which is that for many years I was aware that growth is impossible to continue on a finite planet, that our entire modern enterprise was based on fossil fuels, and those were not only causing a severe climate problem, but are finite, and we can't count on that going forever. That agriculture is completely predicated on not modern agriculture on fossil fuels, and so the 8 billion people we're going to really struggle to maintain um, without fossil fuels. And so we sort of were in a trap, and I had a lot of anxiety about what does that mean for us? And my internal driver at that point was, how do we keep this thing going? Because we can't let this amazing business that we built fail. And so that's still mainly where I was when I wrote the textbook, although it was tempered with a sense that we can't keep going as we are. We're going to have to tone things down. But at the time, I wasn't really convinced that the entire modernity project was ill-fated and not really capable of long-term existence. And so, at that stage in my prior sort of self, I really worried a lot about how this amazing thing that we have of science, how that survives. If we allow a collapse, that would be terrible and frightening, and we could lose everything. We could lose our scientific knowledge, and that to me was the most precious of everything.
And there's
Um,
historical precedent for that. I mean, there's entire bodies of knowledge that have been lost, and like the Romans discovered all this great stuff about concrete, which then was lost, and we didn't rediscover it until early 20th century or something like that. So it completely
right.
happens that bodies of knowledge can be lost, sometimes rediscovered, sometimes not rediscovered. So it sounds like did you to what extent were you inhabiting sort of a dominant cultural myth that we have is this myth of progress? And it sounds like
Yeah.
you got out from under that. What was that like? And did it make it hard to interact with science students, science faculty? Like, did you feel like all of a sudden you're kind of an alien creature, like you're not adhering to the dominant mythos, or
Yeah, totally. Although most of my transition happened when I took more time to be outside of that world and then retired pretty early. And so I have changed quite a lot since then because I've had more time to study this problem and think about it, and I'm not as distracted by the day in, day out demands of a job and a research project and so forth. Um, so if I returned today, just, a little over a year after I left, I would certainly not fit in very well because um, that is a system that is completely hook, line, and sinker taken into this paradigm and this mythos about where we are going and where we're supposed to be going and how we get there. And I just can't see it that way anymore. And so if I had to continue teaching classes on nuts and bolts, physics and laboratory techniques and whatever else, I would feel not only was I wasting my time and not doing something that I felt, passionate about anymore, but that I was doing a disservice to the world by propagating the wrong set of skills and ways to think. And so, yeah, I'm totally a misfit at this point.
I think maybe throughout the conversation we can kind of circle into this topic because it's something very interesting to us about how to how to find points of resonance with people. I mean, I had an academic career too, and I would just try a similar thing of like progressively becoming more of a misfit to where I feel like I'm not doing myself or anyone else any favors by being here. And on my part, a sense of failure. Like I really wanted to be able to explain myself to my colleagues and make it make sense, and
Right.
I just failed basically, you know. But um, but I still really want to reach people, you know. But I guess to a certain extent, people have to be reachable. So maybe we can kind of circle into that. I want to touch on. So in your metastatic modernity series, I actually went through it the other day. I went through the whole thing. You can do it actually in a couple hours, you know, and it's really tightly produced, which is cool. It seems like you are placing modernity essentially from the dawn of agriculture forward. And I think a lot of people, including myself, kind of going into it, when I think of modernity, I might think the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, like that. I would put it that period. But you're kind
Mhm.
of stretching it back and saying basically agriculture forward is modernity. Is that right? And why do you choose that framing?
Yeah, that's more or less correct, although it's not a binary situation where we suddenly switched on and it was full modernity. It was obviously ramping up, and you're absolutely right that the Enlightenment and the advent of science as we know it really put the thing on steroids. So it amplified our degree of control, although agriculture is when we really started a massive attempt to control nature.
Mhm.
And that's when we pulled ourselves out of our ecological context that humans had lived in for millions of years and Homo sapiens for two or 300,000 years. And this was a very new uh, way that kind of decided as if gods which animals should be killed and which plants should be killed and which ones should live and exercising this dominion over the land. So that was an enormous shift. And once you have that mentality, science becomes a tool to further elaborate those tendencies. And so science isn't what changed us. It just changed how good we were at doing the things that we already were fully invested in doing
Mhm.
by that time. And then fossil fuels just completely jack that up even to a greater degree. But the foundations were already present and had been for many millennia at that stage.
Okay. There's another series that you did that is really interesting, and I want to dive into it a little bit. You sent it to me before on your, you kind of like took a detour into demographics and built your own population model and compared it to um, some of the standard projections of population from the UN and that sort of thing. Um, I'm trying to think how I want to get into this. One
Well,
of the things,
maybe we could put a pin in that for a second because I
yeah,
just realized that I never kind of answered the previous question about this metastatic modernity and what is that project and how did it come about and so forth because I got sidetracked on talking about this textbook and how it was the wrong form. And so the metastatic modernity is my latest attempt to kind of get my head around the entire problem, although that's impossible. I mean, that's one of the things I learned in this process is that that's a bit of a delusion that any of us can fully understand a context as large as reality. But in any case, this is my synthesis of um, a arrival at a new place that tries to put modernity into context, um, and things like renewable energy and where that kind of fits in, and human supremacy is a piece of this. But a lot of it's ecologically based, and respects our biological inheritance, respects our, the fact that an amoeba has 13,000 genes. We have 20,000, not dramatically different in number. And of those amoeba's genes, we share a third of those genes because we do a lot of the same things. Our cells do a lot of the exact same processes that were learned and developed by life billions of years ago. So that heritage is incredibly important. We are all connected. We are, in a sense, life is one big um, mess of you know arrangements of atoms that are doing amazing, spectacular, dumbfounding, in unfathomable things that we'll never fully understand using these puny brains. It's much bigger. We think of ourselves as having superseded that boring, you know, uh, kind of arcane and obsolete past, but that's quite the opposite from reality, where that is the main force on this planet that we are a part of. And so I think now as life is somewhat partitioned into different organisms, and you have strands of DNA in different places that have a lot of heritage and sharing, but they also are interacting through, real world experiences and co-evolving, and a change in one piece of snippet of DNA in this organism results in a change in this organism and throughout the entire web.
Mhm.
So no species is just some isolated, separate entity. Every species is a part of the entire whole, and we're no different. And we can't exist without the sun. We can't exist without rocks. We can't exist without microbes.
Mhm.
So that's a big part of metastatic modernity, is recognizing that we are that fully integrated into an ecological context, which our modern world just completely ignores and it sort of skips over. Um, and and that this modernity acts like a cancer.
Mhm.
So it acts like an affliction onto humans. Humans are not the cancer. Humans aren't, it's not baked into our DNA to be bad news for the planet.
Mhm.
It's how we decide to live, the cultural practices and choices. Those create different outcomes, and the modernity one is just rotten. It's incompatible with ecological health, and we're showing it in every possible way.
It
And
seems
it's
like it's got
not
a
a matter
lot
of
of programming.
tweaks.
It seems like it's got a lot of programming in it that produces short-term gain at tremendous long-term cost. That's
Absolutely.
that's kind of coded into it. So,
Right. And cancer cell is the same way.
right.
Short-term gain, hey, I can grow. Look at that. Isn't that great? But long-term, even the cancer dies. Even that cancer cell kills its host, and it's a bad strategy. It just never could have worked. And that's what modernity is. Never could have worked because it fundamentally ruins the very foundation that it depends upon.
So you've mentioned that you kind of look back on the textbook project that you have with like some satisfaction and some dissatisfaction with how it turned out. And so moving on from that, you created this series of short videos. Is there a plan to do another textbook or a revised version, or what are you thinking about in terms of your outreach tools? And like, okay, so typically you come from academia, you're like, I have a bunch of ideas I want to put together as a body of work. It makes sense. Make a textbook, have a class, create a certificate program. Coming from the system, we that's how we think. Like this is how you produce some new knowledge in the world or something. But then, as we discussed, a lot of components of the university system are maladaptive and dysfunctional when it comes to facing down this crisis. So what are you thinking about in terms of your outreach materials, and like what's like what who's your audience? Do you think it makes sense to target younger people at an earlier stage before they get too baked into the modernity pipeline, or what do you have kind of a strategy? Can you explain it a bit?
I certainly do not have much of a strategy. I'm feeling my way through this, and I have this impulse, as you do, and you just described, to reach people and to share, your understanding of things and your evolving thinking about things. And that's where I am. The blog does that. The audience is not very large, but I think very appreciative of the fact that there's some place they can go to not feel as isolated
Mhm.
on thinking these ways. And it has helped a number of people change how they view the world. And that's great. Even if I reach one person, I feel like I've done something valuable with my time. So this is not a kind of message that can be easily packaged for a classroom. I mean, I dealt with, certainly not in a physics department. They just, that has, it's neither here nor there. There's almost no interest in something that of that sort. And it's so multidisciplinary in a sense that nobody would really own this. And it's too heterodox to be really accepted, except by maybe some eccentric, professor who probably shouldn't even be in that institution because they're such a misfit. So, it's not something that can be really ported to a curriculum in any mainstream sense. Um, I'm just relying on, I put everything out there. It sits waiting for people to find it and discover it, and maybe word of mouth can help. But I'm at a loss because I mean I interact with a lot of people. I have friends and I have a community, and occasionally I'll broach these topics with them, and my friends tolerate it. Some of my friends want to discuss these things, but it's rare. It's hard to find those kinds of folks. So I appreciate how small this community is. Will the young people adopt these kinds of attitudes? I think there's a potential for that, but I'm continually disappointed. Um, I was in front of classrooms with 18 to 22-year-olds for many years, and there are definitely some bright shining stars within that cohort, but by and large, that's not where they are. But things change generationally. I don't think Gen Z is necessarily, on the whole, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but their concerns are valid, um, but partial, I think, is the way I kind of see it. Is that they're not questioning the entire edifice of modernity. They're just questioning how we do it and how we can perfect this system so that people are treated more fairly and equitably. And I don't disagree with that notion. It's just that I've come to a place where no version of modernity works. And if you really want to dignify human life, you have to consider humans as part of a community of life and dignify the entire set and not privilege humans to the exclusion and detriment and extinction of other species. So I think a lot of the impulses in the younger generation are great. I just wish they were much broader to extend beyond human concerns. Because in the end, everything is a human concern. Ecological concern is the most important of all human concerns in the long term.
Mhm.
So it's short-sighted to ignore those realms.
Yeah, I certainly had the unpleasant feeling of when I was teaching that we're not preparing students for the present, let alone the future, because things seem to be changing so fast. And I don't know, we're preparing them for a future that's not going to happen and a
I agree.
conflict that we're not going to have. And we're kind of doing them a disservice. But I couldn't figure out how to pivot out of that. So I kind of just gave up.
Yeah, and my experience was, the students that I would teach in the last few years would say things like, the first couple weeks they were a little stunned and they didn't know quite what to think about it. But by the end of the quarter, they would say, this is the most important class I've had in college, and I can't for the life of me understand why nobody else, I'm a senior, and nobody else has talked about any of these things.
Hmm.
And so they are a bit angry that they have been prepared for a world that is, you know, the rear view mirror world, which if, and I have to be careful here because this process of winding down modernity will it's going to go kicking and screaming, and it's going to pull out all the stops to keep the wheels on as long as it possibly can, and we should not underestimate its ability to succeed to a partial degree in doing that because so many vested interests are aligned to want to keep things basically the way they are. um, and so this is going to take many generations to fully express. And it may be that in the lifetimes of the students that I taught, it's just the early stages that they're seeing, but maybe the degree that they got and the training they got will serve them just fine for the 3, 4 decade career that they're going to have. So I might be jumping the gun in that sense and scaring them for no reason. But I'm not doing it to scare them. I'm doing it to look at the longer view and recognize what's not possible, and stop fooling ourselves about what the future has to become. And let's get busy living in ways that are compatible with long-term existence on the planet.
Right. So let's go into that a little bit. You know, I think about this in the sense like, okay, I could evangelize these ideas as much as I want, and it's not going to have much of an effect. I'm not going to persuade that many people. A handful of people are persuadable or probably already persuaded themselves. So okay, if you link up with people and say, okay, this is kind of the crisis we're facing down, what are the next steps? What kind of projects should we implement in parallel? We're not gonna stop modernity, but we can make something parallel to it that, if nothing else, will provide respite, relief, support, some kind of benefit. I feel like you're in a war, right? You can't stop the war going on around you, but you can help the injured person next to you. There's still like stuff to do.
Mhm.
There's still priorities under that, tumultuous situation. So what do you, in that sense, like what do you look to for these kind of, I don't know, triage and reaction efforts under the circumstances?
Well, I think my basic attitude has shifted enough that I don't think any centralized approach works. I don't think that the far future of successful humans involves a, you know, nation state scale approach. I think it's going to be a lot of local solutions that look different all around the world because every place in the world has its own, unique
Mhm.
set of circumstances and opportunities and dangers and whatever else. So um, I don't think there's a one size fits all, and I don't think we should try to design that. But I do think that some core principles could be useful. And as long as, I guess my hope is that enough people have been exposed to some of these core principles that when they are trying to communicate with their local community and figure out how to go, they have a bit of wisdom to offer on just big picture, which kinds of attitudes are likely to be favorable versus disfavorable to this enterprise and to what we're trying to achieve. So I don't think of it in terms of programs. I don't think of it in terms of you know, fighting. It's more of a guerrilla war. It's not, engaging in the same way, using the same tools as modernity itself, because it sort of defeats itself if you try to organize it that way in a sense. So I think more granularly at the individual level, just reaching enough individuals who are um, I guess not fitting in quite right into their communities right now because they're modernity oriented and human supremacist cultures, and just having enough people who recognize that there are different ways to think and and to live in this world.
You mentioned a couple times this term human supremacy. So people maybe haven't heard that. So do you want to give kind of a definition and explain a bit why you chose to frame it that way?
Yeah, so human supremacy, I first started calling it human exceptionalism because it occurred to me that one of the big foundational problems is how we separate ourselves from nature. We think that we're above it, we're better than it, we're the pinnacle of evolution. It's our destiny to master this world, to be its overseers, its overlords. That other species are just only important to the extent that they serve us somehow.
Mhm.
And and so it's a very narrow viewpoint, but very widespread. And I started calling it not human exceptionalism, but human supremacy, because human exceptionalism, it's true, we're exceptional species. We can do some things that no other species can, and it's very obvious. You look out the window and you see it. We have it all around us, and so we are indeed exceptional. But bats are exceptional too. They can do sonar, and we can't do that. I mean, so they're almost everything in the living world is exceptional in some way. Um, and so that wasn't quite right. Human supremacy is a little more charged. It's a little more in your face that, but it's more accurate in a sense that it's the problem is not having exceptional qualities because we do and other species do as well. It's that we assume that gives us the right, and any right, by the way, is a construction. It's a fiction that we generate to justify the things that we maybe want or think we deserve. But uh, human supremacy is that we feel that we are not just exceptional but superior and have a right to dominion over the entire living world. So that to me is really ugly. I like the term. I didn't come up with it, but I instantly loved it. Eileen Christ called it the human Reich, that we are engaged in this human Reich society and culture. And there are a lot of parallels to how we treat other species and how white supremacists and Aryan supremacists treated other races of humans, and it's just terribly ugly. And once you see modernity through that lens, it's everywhere. It just is the fabric of our society, and I just don't want any part of that anymore. So that is another another wedge driven between me and most of the people that I'm surrounded by.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I don't know if I could point to a specific example of this, but there's definitely times over the years that I've been, occasionally read your blog or I'll see you on a podcast or something like that. And a feeling that's come up for me several times is, and I hope you don't take offense to this, is I feel like Tom is taking a long circuitous route to Christianity or to religion or something.
Okay.
Like you're a scientist who is plotting this course, and I'm like, is he going to end up like having some kind of religious conversion? And then I was kind of surfing around a bit on your blog, and it's you have written on religion. So,
Yeah.
so do you want to talk about your background, your growing up, like what interactions have you had with religion, and what are your thoughts on it now?
Sure. I grew up in Tennessee, in a Methodist kind of church. We would go to church basically every Sunday. I started in fifth grade going to a Catholic school, and we did mass every morning. We went to mass every weekday morning for years. And so I've been in churches a lot. Um,
And what was it a
and
good experience? Was it a bad experience? Was it just boring old church that you had to do that the adults made you do it, or what? How did you feel about
mostly, at least in the Southern Methodist tradition, it's just social. It's not very uh Jesus-y. I mean, you have that foundation, but it's mostly just a social organization of decent people do this. This is, what we're supposed to do. So, but not evangelical or a fundamentalist or that kind of thing. So I was surrounded by that in the South. I mean, I saw plenty of it and had, friends, roommates who were this way. So I've had lots of discussions
Mhm.
um, on religion and was more of a. So I think for me as a teenager, I started worrying about the God that we were asked to believe in and how punitive that God is, and how uh, that's seemed the opposite of loving, to condemn somebody to eternal damnation,
Mhm.
uh, eternal, infinite, just this horrendous experience in hell. Uh, and I thought, really? Is that the God that I want to believe in, or that we also hear about as loving and compassionate, doing that even to a an infant who hasn't been baptized?
Mhm.
Like, sorry, tough luck, kid.
Yeah.
Eternal damnation, enjoy the flames. I had trouble with that.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that when I have had discussions with fundamentalists, that tends to be the hardest point for them to admit, is that yes, our teachings would say that that unbaptized child who might be a total delight and is just the best, little kid, uh, eternal damnation. And so they have trouble with it, and they should. So I started inventing, and I felt like Ptolemy with epicycles to explain, jigs and jags in orbits. Um, I was inventing new elements that would help me cope with it. So reincarnation, I thought, well, that must be the answer. That, you just get a second chance and you keep trying until you get it right. And then, okay, now you can go to heaven. But, that's what a compassionate God would do. And
Mhm.
so I was, it wasn't a long period of my life as a teenager, less than a year probably, I was a firm believer in reincarnation because that just made a lot more sense to me. But as I kept trying to fix the problems that I was having, it became too unwieldy. And one of my friends, a close friend, who was also into astronomy, and I had a lot of discussions. And he was a few years older than I was, and had already kind of shed his religious background. And my discussions with him really helped me do the same thing. So anyhow, that I think by the time I left high school, I would have called myself an agnostic, not strident and saying that I know all the answers. But yeah, at this point, to fast forward, I did have a post called "A Religion of Life," and it basically is just I'm awestruck by the phenomenon of life. It's really remarkable that we get to experience this. Um, it's unimaginably amazing. And I say that with this recognition that our brains are not capable of fully understanding how amazing this thing is. Evolution took place over billions of years, and the wisdom that's part of that experience of deep time is beyond our capabilities to understand and replicate. And, I think I share a story in that post about, the fox and the quail, which should go hungry, which should be, should the quail be killed to satisfy the fox and feed its babies? And if you spare the quail, does it eat the grasshopper? And there's there are all these life and death things going on in the world, and who gets to decide? And previous cultures would have said that's in the hands of the gods. The gods have wisdom, and they decide if it's your day to feast or perish or whatever it is. Um, and the gods in this case is really, it is wisdom, and it's the wisdom of an evolutionary context and ecological context that works. So foxes are as successful as they are because if they were any more or less, they would wipe themselves out.
Mhm.
Quail are as successful at evading as they are because if they were much more successful or less successful, the ecosystem would fail. So it's really tuned um, to a remarkable degree and remarkable complexity because it's not just a fox and a quail and a grasshopper. This, everything has branches that connects the entire community and web of life. So it's it's as amazing as it is because that's the only way it can work. Um, and ideas that don't really work out, that don't have that wisdom embedded. And again, it's a wisdom that is expressed over uh, tens of thousands of years and tuned on those kinds of timescales. So we have no concept of that. So any harebrained idea that we come up with lacks all of that context and all of that deep time wisdom. It's almost certainly going to fail unless it's integrated into those natural cycles, rhythms, tunings. So when we decide to do agriculture, uh, science, whatever, it's not respecting that deep time context. And to me, it is something of a religion at this point, for me personally, that I am in such awe of this incredible construct of life that I can't ever comprehend. And so it does put it in the realm of almost supernatural because it's beyond my capacity and or anybody's capacity to really master, and we just have to subject ourselves to it and feel lucky to be a part of it and to have a role at all. So it is somewhat religious for me, or takes a similar place in my brain as religion and for others might.
Do you see that? Do you see that kind of thinking making inroads with people that are religious in more of a traditional sense? Like, is there any sort of a common language there that like where you could connect with people that are coming from a more traditional view, or
That's
is
an
it
interesting
just a
question.
little too foreign, maybe?
No, I think it's an interesting question, and I will say that um, I caught myself some years ago being guilty of something I had charged others with, and it's what I call the libertarian fallacy. And the libertarian fallacy is, I would say, libertarians that I know are tend to be very smart people. They're intellectuals, and respectable in many ways. And one of the premises is, paraphrasing, look, I don't need government to tell me how to behave to be reasonable and responsible, and uh, you know, I can uh, I can take care of myself, and we don't need government to the extent that we have it. And okay, I see that if everybody in the world were like me, it would be a fantastic place. But the fact is that it doesn't work in our modern society. Um, it's you don't have everybody feeling the same way and taking that personal ownership and responsibility. So that's the fallacy, is that it doesn't work. And so I was guilty of thinking that about religion at some stage in my life, that it causes maybe more harm than good. It's unnecessary. It's not correct. It's a mythology, um, and it's not really solving our problems. And so, why do we have it? But the fallacy is that humans have had religion in some form forever.
Mhm.
And so I don't think it's reasonable to separate us from religion. That is part of who we are. We make up stories that tell us who we are and how we should behave. And I think that's actually good if the stories are tuned to an ecologically responsible way to live. So you had all number of different stories and mythologies in indigenous people, and a lot of them had animist kind of leanings. And those stories tended to preach kind of a humility. We're a part of a much larger whole. We are, um, you know, we don't need to take everything that's there It's not for us. We don't own it. We belong to the earth. It doesn't belong to us. So there are a lot of stories and mythologies that really serve to help us build mental models around how we ought to behave. The religions that came up after agriculture started were religions of dominion and supremacy and um, and special status on the planet. And so those mythologies, I think, uh, can amplify these harmful traits. So I definitely think that religion is a fascinating piece that has to be a part of all human cultures. And there might be some common ground between, say, an animist religion of life, emphasizing life and our role within it, and some, say, Christian or monotheistic uh, traits. I mean, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
Fine. Let's say others means all life. Okay. So you can put some of the things pretty easily, but some of the things would just not find any way to port.
Right. So that was a point in the Metastatic Modernity series that I got stuck on a little bit. And I understand you're going for concision and clarity. And I felt like there was a pretty cut and dried distinction where it was like animist religious views were integrated with nature. And then you had agriculture and you had the supremacy narrative and the dominion aspect put on top of that. And I guess my feeling is I don't deny that those elements are there, but I have questions. Like one, my sort of understand, and I'm not an expert in this stuff at all, but like my understanding about how religions develop over time, it's not like religion A gets switched off, religion B gets switched on, but religion B rather gets layered on top of religion A, and they
Yeah.
incorporate elements of it, you know? And so when I was reading through some of your description about animism, I was like, well, in my experience, Christianity and other modern religions have elements of that too. Like they didn't throw all that stuff out and become solely dominating. And at
Sure.
the same time, that there is that there's the I mean the Bible is such a it's a mixed bag, like it's the most mixed bag of mixed bag. It's I can't make heads or tails out of it, you know, a lot of times. But I want to try to see. I mean, I think I just project my own vibes onto everything, you know. But my feeling is that at the same time that there's the dominion kind of vibes, there's also all of these admonitions about whatever you do, don't try to become God. Don't try to become a God.
Hmm.
Like the humility is there also, you know? And
Hmm.
I feel
Hmm.
like what happens a lot of times is you'll have this mixed bag, and then a culture will select parts of it and say it's this. You know what I mean? And so I
Yeah.
kind of feel like it gets a little bit skewered for, you know, some of these maladaptive or short-term adaptive, long-term maladaptive elements. And I kind of want to see in it, I want to draw out the other, like what you're talking about. And I think it's there, you know, I think it's there. I just as a note of background, I also grew up normie Methodist, you know, like it was nice and polite at church and it wasn't evangelical. And I had my first sort of like sparring with evangelicals when I went to college. I had never met people that had a
Hmm.
real strong vibe on like being saved and heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff. So I think I had a really kind of similar experience. And so my attitude, I'd say by temperament, I'm an agnostic. I'm very ecumenical. I have kind of an ecological view of religion. Like I've lived in Asia, you know, for a
Hmm.
lot of my adult life. And to me, like the type of Buddhism that they have in Thailand makes sense in Thailand. Like you have the natural ecology of the world, you have the human ecology, which is interspersed with that natural ecology, and everything like our food and culture and music and style of dress and all that stuff is informed by our physical geography and our local ecology, and our culture is informed from that, and our religion is informed from that. So I kind of see like being a Hindu in India is a thing that makes sense from an ecological standpoint in India, you
Hmm.
know. And I'm like, and we used to call the West Christendom, right? And so I know it's really, really unfashionable now, but I kind of feel like, and this, I'm not an evangelical. I'm basically an agnostic, but I'm also kind of like, okay, for better or worse, we come from a Christian culture. Can we just be like, look, we're not sweeping all the bad stuff under the rug, but we're just saying like, this is who we are. This is where we come from. We have to take the good with the bad. And could we work on becoming the best version of that thing? You know, and so I know you're being concise in your thing and making it cut and dried between the animistic view and the later sort of modern religion view, but I wonder how much these things are really actually intermeshed inextricably with each other. And is there any hope in like look at the Christian, I mean there's things like the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, love your enemy. So I feel like, could we become the best version of that thing rather than
Yeah.
what the critique we often hear in our culture is all based on the worst aspects of that thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think what you described sounds absolutely right to me. It's a complicated weave of lots of different elements that powerful stories have good staying power. And that's just the way it works. And so I think in all likelihood, the farther future will have recognizable threads of today's religions persisting. Um, but I think that a crisis really invites um, new worldviews to come in because people need explanations and their stories aren't doing it. They're
Mm,
not providing those explanations. And so, I'm just imagining a where did we go wrong could bring a lot more humility and a lot less human supremacy. And, so I think the sort of it has to happen, the the actual events on the ground have to unfold, but before people are checking back with their mythology and starting to really throw out the bad pieces.
mm. Yeah, a reform like that's you're talking about like the mother of all reformations.
Yeah, I think it's unavoidable that going so it's really hard to think about the transition because who knows, that can be very turbulent, but in the end, if we are still around in 100,000 years as humans, it will only be in an ecologically sustainable context. Because by definition, if it's not ecologically sustainable, then we
Mm,
probably continue this sixth mass extinction that we've initiated, and we don't fare well as big, hungry, high maintenance mammals in a sixth mass extinction. So game over. So I think if we are still thriving in 100,000 years, that we thriving in ecological kind of a continuous sustainable way. And I don't want to be I don't have a crystal ball, but let's just say it's 100 million people can live that way. Um, who knows what the answer is, but the point is it is dramatically lower than it is now.
mhm.
Lifestyles are dramatically different, and there's no way that religions aren't utterly transformed
Right,
as well. There's no way.
right.
And so, how that plays out over the next few decades and centuries is kind of anybody's guess, but it has to happen, uh, or we perish from this earth.
Okay, that might be a good segue to another interesting issue that you have highlighted recently, and it's when you kind of delved into demographics and making some projections and stuff like that. I think this will be really interesting to the doomer optimism people. One of the things that you focused on were trends in fertility rates, going back over several decades, and especially focusing on recent decades. And this is something I've heard. You hear a lot of stuff in the news or whatever. Oh, fertility rates are down, and I'm like, is that real? Does it matter? Is this I never paid attention to it really before.
Mhm.
And then I went through your blog posts, and I was like, wow, there's a bunch of reasons why this is really interesting. And basically what I'm alluding to, and I copy pasted some of your graphs onto a slide, which I can throw up and we can discuss if that kind of facilitates things, because I think people should really
Sure.
see this. So I can pull up that slide, but the, so a few things. One, at least in certain countries, there does seem to be a marked decrease in fertility rates, like really in the past 10, 15 years. Like it's a
Right.
recent phenomenon. It's pretty striking.
Yep.
And so I think I want to hear from you. Like, what do we know about why that is? What's driving that? And then the second interesting thing is, um, the establishment demographers, or whatever you want to call them, the UN projections and stuff, have been making all these projections of where population is going to go. And in a bunch of cases, they got it so crazy wrong, right? And so to me, that's interesting. Whenever the experts are way off on something, we could
Right.
definitely have something to learn from that. So let me just see if I can pull up this screen where I just snagged a few examples. Let's see. Hopefully this will work. All right. Can you see the graphs there
Yes.
on the screen? Okay.
Okay.
So these plots I pulled, this is from your blog that you made these out of data that you collected online, presumably. But we're looking at fertility rates in select countries, 1980 and up to today, and then projected out to 2040. So this is a total fertility rate. So you should explain to people what that indicator is. And then I've got several countries here: Finland, China, South Korea, India, US, and Italy. So explain why you focused on total fertility rates and what jumped out at you about these plots.
Yeah, so the fertility rates are super important because, to get demographics, you have births and deaths and nothing in between. No people just pop into existence or pop out without being born or dying. So that's the key really to track. And fertility at the beginning end of life tells you how many babies you're going to have. And this rate, it's not a percentage, it is an absolute number of how many children on average, live births, a woman is expected to have in her lifetime in a particular region or country. And so if you didn't have any attrition and you had perfect symmetry between males and females, the replacement would be two. And it makes sense if you have two children, then the parents have replaced themselves, etc. It turns out to be 2.1 in a modern society with a little bit of attrition and most importantly, a male-female asymmetry, 1.07 males to every 1.0 women. So really for replacement, each woman has to replace herself with another woman to maintain. So it would be 2.07 with no attrition at all. It's 2.1 with slight attrition, and it's a function of survival rates because the global average is actually 2.3 for replacement.
And that's
Based,
because some people don't make it all the way to reproduction age.
that's exactly right. Exactly. So, and in a hunter-gatherer society, it might need to be more like 4 or 5 fertility just to stay steady because there's enough attrition before you get to those reproductive ages, especially infant mortality, that it has to be compensated by more live births. So it's not a fixed number, but right now in an industrial society, affluent society, it's 2.1. So what you see on these graphs is that a lot of these numbers are below replacement, especially, now they're well below 2.0. India is now at 2.0 as the largest population in the world. And what we're seeing is that in the last decade, I mean, if we just look at the last bit of all these plots, they are falling. And this is not cherry picked. This is a fairly global phenomenon. About 70% of countries in the world have a sub-replacement fertility, and the general trend is falling and falling fast. But the UN, the United Nations, puts a projection out every few years, and they project, well, where do we think fertility is going to go from here? And those are the dotted lines, which are a little hard to see, but what you can see just at a glance is how orthogonal they are to the actual trends. The
Mm-hmm.
trend is going down, and the projection is increasing or stabilizing or recovering somehow. So whiff after whiff after whiff, which means that this was an important realization to me that they don't have a model for what's happening in fertility. That's not their model is not as systems level as that. They're just sort of projecting, and really their model is almost as simple as we have in mind what we think the fertility rate should be ultimately, and the farther you are from that, the more quickly you're going to approach
Hmm.
that amount so that it happens in, a certain time scale. Um, and so it's not more sophisticated than that, or only slightly more sophisticated than that. And so they're not tracking the reasons why this is happening, and it's an extreme phenomenon that is, as I say, basically global. Africa is the only region in the world that's not below replacement already. And one thing to clarify is that when you're below replacement, it doesn't mean that you're automatically declining in your population, because you've got a cohort of young people who haven't yet aged into reproductive status. And so you can have a bulge there from previous higher fertility rates that still has to age into reproductive territory. And so you can still have this inertia that keeps the population growing for a time.
Hmm.
If you're below replacement now and you stay below replacement for the next, 20 years, within something like 20 years, you're going to start seeing a peak and decline.
There's a lag,
And
in other words.
there's a lag, that's right. And China has already peaked and declined in a lot of countries, Japan and Germany, Italy. A lot of European countries have already gone over their peak. And this is going to be the story because it's baked in at this point. You're not going to suddenly pop people in as 20-year-olds. It's not how it works.
Yeah.
So we already know where this heads. There's that much sort of inertia, and the train is coming. More countries are going to peak and roll over, and it's going to become a global phenomenon. And you're going to hear just more about it. It's going to be a big story and a lot of consternation about what does this mean? Are we going extinct? There's going to be all kinds of hyperbole about it. But one thing that you're going to definitely hear a lot about is economies collapsing and having, you know, um, three elderly people for every one,
That's
adolescent.
that's where I want to go. That's where I want to go with this. Probably as
Yeah,
a wrap, kind of get into that. But a couple things before we quite get there. I mean,
yeah.
it does seem like with a lot of these examples, Finland and the U.S. and so on, like that's really kind of an astonishing drop in a relatively short period of time. And so, thinking about what the factors that might go into that, my background is in environmental chemistry and engineering. So, immediately I'm like, oh, well, we have all these xenobiotic chemicals we release into the environment. They have effects on reproduction, blah, blah, blah. But so I would throw that in the mix, but it's probably not one thing. What do we actually know about the drivers of these trends?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It's not one thing, it's many things, and they're all operating and in parallel, and it's, a complex system. I've been watching videos about, speculations around the world on what's happening in this country, what's happening in South Korea, and every place has a list of very compelling reasons why they think this is happening, and I think they're all basically right, and many things can be correct at the same time. They're all contributing to this. A lot of it's economic insecurity. A lot of it's, the the price of owning a home is too high. The childcare is difficult. You have to have two jobs. Um, you know, Things like climate change can be a factor. It might seem that the prospects for prosperity are down, that this generation coming up now is not expecting to have the affluence of the previous generations. And that puts a bit of a damper on, well, why should I then bring a child into the world if it's not this period of growth and increasing prospects? So it's a lot of things. And I think that's part of the reason why it's global. Um, and it's part of the reason why it's not likely to suddenly disappear. So I think we're going to look at continued declines, and it could feed on itself in the sense that the economic mayhem caused by this decline will make future prospects look even bleaker,
Mhm.
um, and or could. So the regrettable thing about this is that a lot of people, like, the wankers of the world, um, are going to insist on more babies, and they're going to be pro-natalist, and they're maybe going to remove reproductive rights and family planning and all of these things to try to stop this train, which I don't think will be successful unless it's, brutally coercive, which, don't put it past some regimes to do this. But that's the downside, is that the panic might, instead of seeing this as exactly the right thing to happen, I mean, when I talked about going from 8 billion people to eventually some much smaller number, how does that happen? The best possible way is this: a demographic change where everybody on the planet now will die. We know that for sure. And if you're just replacing those deaths with fewer births, then this population can decline sort of naturally without famine or war. I'm not saying that that won't happen, because the reactions to this could be extreme
Mhm.
and unfortunate and unnecessary. Um, this could be great news. It's the most natural way and humane way to resolve this overhang and overshoot phenomenon. So it's got a lot of good elements to it, but people who care more about the economy than about humanity and about the community of life will try to flog the system into uh, higher fertility.
Right. So this is the last slide with a few more of your graphs here. So we're kind of getting into that discussion now. Um, right. Yeah. Uh, if it's this kind of voluntary demographic, like we're just sort of restraining our reproduction, and I guess the gentleness of that is partly a function of what are the factors lurking behind that decline. And if it is just like you know, I don't know if there's any kind of weird nefarious stuff going on behind that decline. I mean, that's a total speculation. But yeah,
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's completely organic. And just to hit these plots, the one on upper left shows the
right.
total fertility rates for regions. So aggregated regions. Africa is the orange one at the top, which is the only one that's really outstanding.
Mhm.
But the thing that really spun my head on this graph is right where you are at 2020, that all of the regions of the world, and the dark maroon line is the total world aggregate, are falling very fast prior to 2020. It's like a steep little roll off.
Right.
Now look right at 2020 and the 5 years before that. See that steep?
Right.
Yeah, there's a kink in all those lines, and that kink is where the UN demographer said, "Okay, we've got data before now and up to now, but here's our projection." And the kink is unnatural. That's not likely to manifest, because that's just adherence to a notion, an assumption, a model, and not the dynamics that are behind this. And it shows, the previous graph showed how, yeah, they've been wrong about this. They had these kinks in all these countries too. It
Right.
was falling down, and that their model had a kink, but they didn't respect. Guess what? The real world doesn't pay attention to the model.
Like
So,
it's like what they said was, okay, we know what the sort of ideal fertility rate ought to be,
yep,
and we're gonna get there because we're gonna
yep,
all figure it out together. So we're gonna put
yep.
that out here somewhere, and we're just gonna vacuum everything in the direction of
You
this
bet.
particular rate. And so that yeah, so that just like grabbed their model and drug it over there, and
Yep,
it's like you notice that it's this unnatural transition in the graph. How many other people have noticed? And just going back to like here are their predictions year after year. And I guess part of my question is, at what point, how many completely wrong predictions do you have to make before you go, whoa, whoa, whoa? You know what I'm saying? Like it's a bit
yeah,
weird. And so there's something behind it. Like it's just like this idea of the ideal fertility rate that we all must converge on for what
right,
reason? Like they're so
yeah.
attached to that concept they haven't replaced it with a different model.
That's right. And they don't have a model that can tell what all these factors are that are producing this fertility decline. And so it's all just this extrapolation.
Mm,
But it's an extrapolation, as you point out, predicated on some notion of what it's supposed to be.
hmm
Like we know the final answer, it's going to be 1.7 or whatever they have their target. And it's like a magnet. And as you say, it's just drawing all those lines to that imagined place. And when I saw this graph, I was like, oh no, you have to be kidding me. Like it was so apparent what was happening, what they were doing, and how simple. The world is very, very much more complex than this simple model. And so I explored models where the fertility actually kept, the current decline and then stabilizing, not just continuing to go down. I don't think that's realistic,
hmm
nor is my model realistic. But that's not the point. No model can be realistic, but you can paint the parameter space and explore plausible scenarios. And I explored what I thought was a plausible scenario of whatever trend this is happening, it's going to be, persist for the next decade. And
hmm
that's what leads to the plot on the upper right. That blue curve is the population curve that manifests from my alternate fertility kind of projection compared to the black line, which is the UN projection. And the differences are pretty dramatic in terms of the number of people it means. And this is not from war or famine or anything like that. As I said, it's just natural attrition and lower than replacement uh, fertility. And the peak is much earlier. So could be 2040 or something in that ballpark at 8.5, 9 billion people and not 10.5 billion in late century.
Right.
So that makes a huge difference to the second half of this century. If something like this manifests, could well be a paradigm shift of economies that are suddenly have never had to face decline
hmm
and negative growth. And how they do that is anybody's guess, but guess what? They're not talking about it. There's no plan for this.
hmm
It's just denial. It's easier to say, no, no, that's not going to be the way of things because we've always been growing, and so that's the world that we've always known. And so why would the world change? And well, there are reasons the world changes,
I'll
but
say, yeah, 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 but technology, but efficiency, blah blah blah.
yeah, all this, hand wavy stuff. Yeah,
So the next clever thing that you did was you said, okay, well, in recent decades, there's a pretty stable relationship between energy consumption per capita as a proxy for overall economic activity and material use and resource extraction, all that kind of stuff. So you just cross-reference that with population projections. And the interesting thing here that you found, if you could explain a little bit, is so in you know people could go to your blog and look at all your assumptions and decide whether they think it's reasonable or not. So for
exactly. Right.
this conversation, we're just assuming that you made reasonable inputs. I think they're reasonable. And that says, okay, population then potentially could peak around 2040. But then if you cross-reference that with materials use or energy use, we see an earlier peak in energy throughput of the economy. So explain why the energy peak is earlier than the population peak, and and then explain how that pertains to economic growth.
Okay, so the main story for this is that Africa is the dominant growing sector of population. It's got the high fertility rate, and so, above four, and so it's just continuing to soar upward in population, which I think is a finite game. I think the biophysical constraints are going to kind of pull that back down, or pull it down. So, but in any case, you've got a lot of the population growth is in Africa, which has the lowest, by far, the lowest per capita energy usage in the world. It's 500 watts compared to 10,000 watts in the US, so a factor of 20 different. And most areas of the world are, Europe is 5,000 watts and Asia is maybe 2,500 watts. It's something like that. So Africa, it, a continuing population growth in Africa doesn't have very much impact on the total energy usage of the world. And Asia is the dominant, that the subcurves below on the bottom plot are different regions. And the maroon at the top is the whole world, but then this gray line is Asia halfway up. And so Asia is dominating the story because its population is quite large. And it's going to hit a population peak earlier than the global population peak because Africa is continuing to pull that forward later. And so the energy use at this sort of fixed per capita rate would peak globally well before the population peak, or a decade or so before the population peak,
Mm.
because the high energy sectors of the world are peaking earlier than the world as a whole. And so I think that this is really fascinating because the downside, I mean, energy use is a very good proxy for economic activity. It's almost, it's tied at the hip, 99% correlation. It's really highly correlated. And so a substantial decline in energy use is will, I believe, be associated with a substantial decline in economic activity. And how do financial institutions deal with that? How do economies deal with that? I mean, a lot of things are predicated on growth, social safety net systems, and medical insurance, and pensions, and just investment. I mean, what happens when you think, well, apartment buildings are emptying out and we have more housing than we have people. We have more schools than we have students. We have more malls than we have shoppers. This is not rosy news for economics, which is why the wankers of the world are panicked about this and calling for babies, babies, babies. We need consumers, we need profit. So it's when your priorities are on the wrong thing, you're going to get some wrong
Right.
responses.
Yeah, so that's a reaction to that is like, oh no, we need more babies so that we can have more economic growth and so that the younger people can take care of retirees and so on. But it seems
Mhm.
like your feeling is that yeah, there'll be a lot of push for that kind of thing, but it's not really going to work because you can't conjure people out of nothing, and like it's unlikely that these trends are there for a reason, and they're for an organic reason. They're not likely. So
And
that
for many reasons, all operating in parallel at once. And you're not going to wipe all of them out. It's a whack-a-mole problem. You're not just going to eliminate this.
Right. So okay. So I think this is kind of leading me towards where we can wrap. But the first part of that is, and the point that really hit me in the forehead is, okay, in the doom or optimism sphere, we look at all sorts of doom, all sorts of calamities that we're facing. The conversations range really wide, and then optimism of like responses to that sort of thing. And one question we always come to is like, okay, whether it's peak oil or fossil fuel use or the problems with unsustainable agriculture or whatever, it was like, well, what's the timeline? What's the timeline is going to happen on, whatever. Well, this is, I mean, granted, this is a model. It has inputs and assumptions and that sort of thing, but
Yeah,
it's
don't take it literally. None,
it's not,
don't take any model literally.
no, no. I mean, all
Yeah,
models are wrong, but some models are useful.
right.
But at least we could say it's a plausible scenario that, peak in population could arrive by 2040, peak in resource use, and therefore sort of peak in economic growth could arrive by maybe as early as 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
that's plausible, that's possible, and that is really soon, and that's really soon, and that's likely to be accompanied by a lot of dislocations, right? Like that's could potentially be a really tumultuous time to go through. That's relevant to our lives. I mean, those of us who have kids, my son will be 18 in 2040, right? So,
Hmm.
according to the 20th century way of thinking, he's going to go off to college. I don't know what the world is going to look like in 2040. It looks like we're in for a lot of shakeups. So, who can say what things are going to look like? But I mean, I guess that's the part that I wanted to get you to riff on a little bit is, with the plausibility that we could see this uh, demand side constraint on growth and, maybe a pincher effect with supply side on resource constraints. I mean, it kind of seems like, at least in the doomer optimism world, where we're weird people confronting these weird problems, misfits from various sectors of society that confront this stuff, it seems like we ought to be like, this shit's about to get real. We better, get, get busy if we're not already busy. Most of us already are busy. But do you think that this is a signal? Start making your preparations, you know?
Yeah.
okay, or am I being alarmist, or what are your feelings about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess prior to doing this work, which I didn't have an expectation coming out, I thought the UN must know what they're doing and, what am I missing? So let me dig in and find out what, when you do track cohorts and the age distribution, maybe I'll say, oh, that's why there's this huge bulge coming. And I just, who knew? But there it is. So it's new to me. Before that, I would have said, when do things get really weird? It could be anytime between 2030 and 2080, some 50-year window.
Mhm.
Um, or later. I always said, and don't don't be surprised if we kick the can down the road and we figure out how to push it off even farther. So who knows? I probably won't see it, or there's a good likelihood I won't see it. Now I'm thinking, well, I might. I mean, I don't know what would stop this demographic train. I really don't. It's kind of cooked in, and I don't think it's going to change rapidly. So all you need to do is maintain something like what's happening, or even just stop it where it is for something like 10 or 15 years, and boom, you've got a population peak. Just kind of it's in the cards. So I do think that it's going to happen. I think it's going to be a big story. I think the total repercussions will be a little bit late. I mean, on the downside, but maybe not super late because economies react, real time to the conditions on the ground. So I think, as you say, it could be a demand side, but supply side will play a role too because you saw the disruptions that we had in supply chains in COVID, and so that was maybe a little baby um, kind of experience where you've got now kind of maybe global disruptions and shuttering factories or mining operations or whatever that um, throw a wrench into everything. So I I feel like probably what I would hope happens out of this is just kind of a recognition that institutions are not any longer able to provide what they did. Things are sort of getting a little unpredictable and untrustworthy and unreliable. And so we just need to take care of our own. We need to, okay, the Medicare is not paying for my elderly parent, but you know what? We've got an extra room. And so it just sort of organically at the local level, people just figure out, okay, well, this thing isn't working anymore. What can I do here that will be adequate? And so I think, adequate is a good word. We're looking for, an adequate transition. And and I think people are pretty creative on the spot when driven, and when the normal options aren't there. So in fact, I'll just say briefly that I think that the recent election results might have a similar effect where our institutions just become a lot less reliable and a lot less service oriented toward the people. And so I think a lot of people might react to that by just abandoning the institutions, not in mass, not sort of all of a sudden the whole country is no longer paying taxes or something like that, but I do think that there's going to be this erosion of trust in the institutions, erosion of dependence on the institutions, and in the end, I mean, much as I might hate to say it, that might be exactly what we need.
Mhm.
It's not maybe my preference of how it would play out, but there can be an upside to it, which is that this is what has to happen in the end anyway. And so whether it's population decline or election results, I think institutions are going to struggle going
My sense is
forward.
that's already the
Yeah,
case in a
yeah,
lot of
I believe so.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
And
mo
I
more of that, and we can be inventive and just sort of make do and figure out how to get by without some of those dependencies.
this is an awesome way to wrap. Okay. Um, so there's a lot of individual issues that anybody could get really upset about, worried about, anxious about, bent out of shape about, right? Like, oh no, for just example, our institutions are losing credibility. No one's going to depend on the institutions anymore. Well, one, there's ways to look on the bright side, like you were just doing. Like this process has to happen anyway. If we become more self-reliant because we can't rely on that other stuff, that there's many ways that's a good thing. Are is there anything that comes to mind for you that is an issue, that at least some people are really setting their hair on fire over, where it's actually like, actually, we don't even need to worry about that. Like that is really not going to be a problem. We don't have to stress about that. You can cross that off your list of stuff to worry about. Is there anything that comes to mind that you could encourage our listeners to like, if you're worried about this, don't, because it's going to be fine.
Well, actually, almost everything fits in that category for me at this stage. Because once you're no longer in love with modernity, once you no longer think that that's the answer, we just need to get it right. We need people to be better. We need them to be more informed. We need them to be more educated. We need them to vote better. We need them to have better values. We need people to change, 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 change. And then we could get our magic, perfect modernity. When you realize that modernity can't be the final answer anyway, that it is inherently unsustainable and we need to dial it back and replace it with more ecologically minded ways to live on this planet, then most of the things that people burn their hair over are about modernity isn't working right.
Hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, there you go. That's what's going to happen. Maybe don't worry about that and worry about, how do you get by without some of those trappings of modernity? And we could be better off. And look, I'm not free of that myself, and I'm never going to be. I'm going to die, and that's how it's going to happen. Is that the people who are joined at the hip to modernity aren't going to be around in 200 years, period. And so it's going to transition. Individuals don't have to do that transition, and it's going to be a slow process anyway. But individuals now can at least be more relaxed mentally about it and even change their habits so they're less dependent on the trappings of modernity. It's not a call to fully uproot and go full prepper or anything like that. You can just sort of wave it off and just be relaxed. I mean, okay, this thing is going to fade away, and this is part of how it happens.
Ha! See, I was wrong earlier. I thought you were taking a meandering course to Christianity. You're going to become a Buddha. You're almost one already, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
That's
But
a
I will say that I've read some of the Tao, and the first thing is that the Tao that can be written is not the true Tao, and I'm like, precisely right. Our brains are not going to capture the real essence of reality, and the few things I've been exposed to, I find a lot of common ground, although I'm not likely to be a student of it. I don't work that way. I come up with my own conclusions and live with that and it's not that I'm shut out to those things. I'm just um uh I'm just too independent, I think, and I might have a lot of Buddhist and Taoist and whatever else and even Christian elements that and animist elements, all kinds of mash up, and it's all fine. I'm fine with it all.
well. Thank you so much for your time today. I think that you are a lovely person, and I
Oh,
really
thank you.
appreciate your work.
Well, thanks so much.
All
My
right.
wife doesn't tell me that enough, so do you want to get married,
Yeah,
Josh?
I know. Maybe we can have a support group because
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, further on up the road, we'll catch up and see how things are doing. But everyone, go check out Tom Murphy, Do the Math blog, and the Metastasizing Modernity series.
Metastatic modernity. Yeah,
Metastatic Modernity. Okay. Thank you.
sure.